Morning, all. We're going to get kick-started just 1 minute past the hour. So what we thought we'd do is that give you a slight advertorial before we kick proceedings off. And as you see that Elephants Don't Forget is launching its first inaugural conference on consumer duty. We're going to give you the opportunity to not only partake in that, but also have access meaning early bird access, which gives you the opportunity to, at a discounted rate, to take advantage of a wonderful lineup of speakers from all the people that you've heard of over the last 2 years from Elephants Don't Forget webinars. And we're delighted to inform you that Joanna Legg has very kindly accepted the invitation. She's head of consumer policy and outcomes at the FCA. So if you want to get in there early at a wonderful one-day conference, I think it's one-day conference, and you want to do all things consumer duties at the end of the year, this is a great opportunity to get involved there. We will be posting up the same link at the end of the webinar, so take advantage of that, or reach out to the Elephants Don't Forget team who will be able to answer questions on that. So yes, that's our advertorial there. First time we've done this, which is launch conference. Super excited about this. It's going to be a great opportunity to network, also learn from your peers, but also take that consumer duty opportunity to the next level there. So let us know in the chat if you want to partake in that. Let us know also if you want to receive opportunities to send your team or to register your team, because we've got group discounts available there. First 100 tickets at a incredibly reasonable rate as well. So take advantage of that. Good. Moving on to the webinar. We got the opportunity to post and answer your questions in two ways. Number one, the Q&A, which you're probably most familiar with if you're a groupie of Elephants Don't Forget webinars, as well as the chat. So we've got a great lineup of guest speakers there, and we'll try and take your questions on the fly, conscious that there are quite a few of you registered for this webinar. So we'll try and get through those as many as possible. If we can't, we'll take those offline and we'll answer those thereafter in the next few days. I know that Martin's committed to answering your questions on bank holiday, so thank you, Martin, for that. Do appreciate that as well. Yes. Yeah. Good morning, Mark. Yeah. Thank you very much indeed. Yeah. Good morning to you as well. There. Two ways to get involved, or three ways, I should say. First of all, you can post your questions in the chat. Second of all, you can use the Q&A, which is denoted by the two or the double speech bubble there. You can participate that way round. Your name won't be disclosed to anybody on this webinar. If you do pop your hand up virtually and say, yeah, pick me, we won't disclose those names or details of your firms. Alternatively, you can partake in the polls. Polls are a great way to sense check where you are, where you want to be, and gives us a steer, or the panelists a steer, about what you really want to focus on or zero on for the next 59 minutes as well there. Okay. Martin, Andy, just before we start off, why don't you introduce yourselves, actually, because we've got a slightly bit of time, and actually this is the first time in the webinar, probably the last time on this webinar, that we'll actually be on time for things. So Martin, kick us off there. Delighted to welcome you, Martin, to this webinar.
Yeah, lovely. Yeah, no problem. Good morning, everyone. So I'm Martin Canwell. I'm an account manager for Aptean Respond. So Aptean Respond's a software provider. We provide a complaints management system that includes various bits of functionality around that. But we also just love being involved in the industry, just understanding what our customers are talking about, what the challenges are, so that we can just set ourselves up nicely to support them as best we can.
Brilliant. Thank you, Martin. Andy, why don't you introduce yourself?
Thank you, Philip. Delighted to be here. I'm Andy Harrison. I'm the Vulnerable Customers Lead at Fidelity International. Fidelity aims to build better financial futures by providing investment solutions for people. So specifically for individual investors, that is being able to invest their money into pensions, whether that's workplace pension or a self-invested personal pension, stocks and shares, ISAs, financial advice, that kind of stuff.
Fantastic. And Chris.
Yeah, hi, good morning, everyone. Chris Adlard here from Elephants Don't Forget. You obviously heard of us as a company. We deliver solutions that help embed competency across your teams. And I'm absolutely delighted to be on today's webinar with these wonderful panelists as well. Thank you.
Brilliant. And I should say as well, award-winning Andy Harrison at award-winning Fidelity as well. Yes. So yeah, we'd like to big up our guests as well. You know, I know you're not into shameless self-promotion, Andy, but you know, we want to recognize credit when credit's due. So welcome to this webinar. Elephants Don't Forget, my name is Philip Allen. I'm delighted to be your host for the next 60 minutes. We're talking about operationalizing vulnerability, equipping your frontline to identify and support vulnerable customers. This is the webinar where we always cover the issues that matter most. Although when I shared that with my wife today, she said, are you going to cover the birth of Peppa Pig's sister or brother? I said, look, that is for another day, but yeah, we do cover off all the issues that that really pertain and are relevant to organizations like yourselves there. We just want to make sure that we'll be we'll be discussing vulnerability, which includes sensitive issues, and this one we do appreciate that may affect people. So if you're affected by anything discussed, please put your own personal safety first and take the necessary steps to take care of your well-being. I hope you understand why that is super important there. At any point in the discussion, please put your hand up or through the chat or the live discussions. We do welcome your feedback as well as feed forward there. Ask any questions. I'm not too sure whether we can answer everything that you actually say, but we'll try to. A recording of this webinar will be made available to you alongside a PDF version of the slides, and you get to subscribe to Aptean Responds. Great content as well as our own at Elephants Don't Forget. There's an opportunity to invite you to sign up to our Consumer Duty conference as well at the end of this webinar, which we would love to see you in person as well. And that's us. We're all friendly, smiley people. We like to have a good conversation. We're not necessarily going to agree with each other on every single point, but we also want to make sure that you enjoy yourselves, but also take value from this webinar as well. What are we going to talk about? 5 key issues here on the screen. I won't go through every single one of them there, but staying ahead of the regulatory expectations around vulnerability is really important. Empowering case handlers and frontline staff. I think that that's a topic area that we want to really zero in and unpack in ways that we can actually specifically give you advice and guidance and support on that. Better recording and maintaining vulnerability data goes without saying, especially when the regulators focused on improving the knowledge and competency of the design teams, product and service design teams, and actually making sure that we've got a culture that actually is continually improving to ensure good outcomes for all customers, and that's super important there. So we're going to dive into that right away, but we also like to invite you to actually curate the agenda of such like presentations as well. So I think you can see that on the screen there. So how confident are your frontline staff in recognizing and responding to potential characteristics of vulnerability based on their current training? So how confident are your frontline staff in recognizing and responding to potential characteristics of vulnerability? Now, kick us off there, Chris, because there's contrasting issues there. On the one hand, we've got the FCA saying, 88% of firms, are conducting training, which is fine. But on the following page, page 9, or I'll post that in the chat, they also see and indicate limitations in skills and competence there. Where is the disparity, and why is there a disparity there?
I think it's really interesting, isn't it? I think there's a conflicting message in some ways there. Clearly, traditional training programs are being executed, online training, maybe face-to-face sessions, and we can tick the box and say training is happening to help online, frontline teams deal with vulnerability. But the real question is, are they competent to do that? And that's where I think there are opportunities to look at different ways to ensure that staff are really competent to handle vulnerability properly. And that's perhaps where the gap exists, I think.
Reasons why we probably see Martin on the screen there. The lead answer, 48%, are fairly confident of their training, of their team responding to potential characteristics. 23% only slightly confident. Is that cause for concern?
Yeah, I think it is. I think it somewhat reflects obviously what the FCA thinks is happening. And of course, you know, the frontline people are often a first point of contact for these vulnerable customers. It's, you know, going to massively impact the journey that those vulnerable customers experience from that point. So it absolutely needs addressing through a number of different measures. We'll cover those off as we go through the presentation. But I don't think anybody would be sitting here right now feeling like that's a great result and we don't need to shift that up somehow.
Andy, if you were answering this question, I'm putting you on the spot. I do apologize. Would you be in the 5% or very confident?
Probably not. And I think there's a number of reasons for that. I think I fully expected it to come out on the fence. And I think that's partly because the question itself asks you to represent someone else's confidence level, which is quite difficult to do. And perhaps a lot of the people on the call are maybe also working in second line functions like risk and compliance, where you may be a little bit detached from what the first line are doing day to day and how well those sorts of things are being impacted, aside from what you see in thematic reviews and audits and monitoring and things. So that might be a key driver. I also think it's really contextual, right? So there are certain things that I would say people are very confident in, and other things that I'd say people are less confident in. I mean, is anybody confident in dealing with somebody who's talking about harming themselves, taking their own life? Is somebody ever going to be confident in dealing with somebody who's being coercively controlled? I don't know how much training you can have on that to feel very confident.
That's a really good point. I like that there. So let's move on to our second poll question here. And again, we are aware that some of the issues that we're talking about may be challenging for people to listen to, and so we are sensitive to that. So please be aware of that. So to what extent does technology in your firm effectively support the frontline in identifying and assisting vulnerable customers during interactions? So to what extent does technology in your firm effectively support frontline staff there? Martin, it would be folly not to have your expertise to actually give us an understanding of what the landscape of technology and supporting vulnerable customers looks like there. Where are we now, 2 years? 2 years on, board reports expected at the end of July, second board report end of July there. Are we in a better place than we were perhaps a year ago?
Yeah, this space has evolved a lot. And I think, again, if you look at the previous responses, I think organizations recognize there is a gap to be closed in terms of recognizing vulnerability within their processes. And of course, there's different ways of addressing that. Technology is one of them. So, we need to support our frontline colleagues, everyone in the process, in terms of using technology to maybe identify some things that haven't been picked up on in advance, maybe route those automatically to the right people first time to reduce some of the impact on people. And of course, as technology evolves, as we're talking more about AI, there's more and more of a focus on how can we use this more within our processes to get better outcomes for customers.
And Chris, when you're dealing with customers, and obviously EDF uses and leverages AI there, there's a greater understanding of what technology can do to support frontline staff. Is that shifting in terms of like people's number one awareness, but also understanding of the art of the possible around tech?
Yeah, I mean, obviously EDF provides a solution that allows us to ensure employees are competent in what they're doing, which is a key part of the jigsaw puzzle around this. I think the other thing to add is that if firms are just doing the yes, no box ticking exercise around vulnerability with some comments, that's probably insufficient, because we know there are many forms of vulnerability. It's very contextual, as Andy said, and it's time specific. And so the systems really do need to reflect that complexity somehow, whether it's in a CRM system or another app. And that's important to record and update, and then employees need to be competent in doing that. So all of the above are really essential in this whole area of systems and technology, I think.
Andy, how do you deploy tech at Fidelity, and what does that look like? You don't have to name check the vendor, by the way, but yeah, what does that look like for you to actually support frontline staff?
Yeah, I think if I were answering this question, I would say to a great extent. But I think, again, that's contextual, isn't it? Do we want to do it better? Yes, absolutely. Do we have plans to do it better? Yes, absolutely. Do we have tech challenges? 100%. Do we have legacy systems that don't talk to each other? Absolutely. But everything we do is technology supported. The account management systems, the way that we flag and make that information available to handlers to be able to provide support to customers, the way we have our escalation process, the training itself is through technology. So, technology is always in the background. Do we want better technology? Yes. Do we want it to work more effectively? 100%.
Martin, what would you say to the folk who indicated 22% not at all?
Yeah, I think it's hard. Well, it depends on how you interpret the question. So I think if you're interpreting the question as just how much is technology used in the process, and you're saying not at all, I think it's quite a challenge now to explain why you're not, given that a lot of people recognize there is a gap within frontline processes. How can you explain that that's not a tool you think like you should be utilizing? I think if you interpret this question and focus on that effectively word, then actually I think I can understand that, because I think there is extensive use of technology, but I think the effectiveness of that in terms of people understanding what to do with that information, where to record it, how to get that to the right people first time, I think there is still some work to be done there so that people make the most of what systems they've got available.
Yeah, good shout there. Joy, sorry, Andy, did you want to come in there? Did you want to?
No, all good. Thanks.
Okay, good. Let's move ahead to talking about staying ahead and staying ahead of regulatory requirements. It's always useful to talk about it with industry practitioners and subject matter experts that we've got in the virtual room there. And I came across this article by Deloitte, which represented. I always like an infographic, as you know, from these things. It always kind of makes sense of my own understanding of the issues and challenges here. But I thought this was useful because Deloitte analysed 30 FCA publications, and this is, bear in mind, the good practice guide that we saw land a couple of months ago there, and they identified a total of 283 mentions of vulnerability. Vulnerable customers and vulnerability, and they mapped them across the 11 areas that you see on the screen, and those were shoehorned into 4 key areas: identification, measuring, adapting, and governance there. And I thought it was a useful pictorial representation of where the regulator is going with where they expect to see what good looks like, as well as actually a reference point to actually see where firms are challenged by there. Martin, if I came to you, sorry, Andy, if I came to you there, how much do you take from other sectors or areas of the sector and embed those good practices within Fidelity? And what's the importance and the role of understanding what's working, say, in the insurance sector or the payment services sector that you can take away into pensions at Fidelity?
Yeah, lots, and for a lot of reasons. I mean, ultimately, we're all dealing with the same people. So the people that are represented by the FCA's financial lives survey data, UK adults, UK customers, they're customers of multiple of our firms. They live in households, whatever their personal circumstances are and their household circumstances are, that translates into what they need from all of their different service providers. So whether you're an energy company, a water company, a telecoms company, whether you're the broadband company, the bank, the insurance company, the investment and pensions company, we're all impacting the same customers, and therefore the customers are coming to us with needs. Those needs are contextual on the products to some extent, but they all need similar things. If you think about somebody who's moving home, that is their scenario. They then need to do multiple change of address processes with all the companies. So they actually at that point need the same thing from all of us, which is the ability to quickly and easily change their address, ideally without having to go into a branch or provide a lot of information and send documents off. It should be easy, it should be quick, and they've got to do it hundreds of times already. But then if they've got if they're going through a divorce, for example, how that might affect their insurance might be very different from how it might affect their pension and how it might affect their investment account. So sometimes it's product contextual, sometimes it's person contextual, but all of it involves the same people. So we'd be silly in a way not to learn from each other and not to be able to understand how we're meeting people's needs in different ways and be able to feed that back. And of course, the regulation itself is principles based. So it doesn't talk specifically about product, it talks about the customer and those good outcomes. And you can always be able to think about what outcomes the customer receiving and how is that different in my product? How's that different in how we serve those customers?
It wouldn't be surprised the audience or surprise us as panelists that identification came as the top answers, 38%. Adapting and products and services came in, and we'll pick this up later in conversation, 28%. Measuring, 21%. Governance, Chris, 13%. And I'm just going to briefly describe what Deloitte understand by that. And they've broken it down into culture and leadership and skills and capability of staff. Make the case for that to be a higher percentage then.
Well, we're going to talk about culture later, aren't we? But for me, embedding that culture of vulnerability across the entire organization is fundamental to this. And a lot of it is about educating all staff, whether in product teams or frontline. So I'm surprised it's that low, but it feels like it's definitely on the rise. And, you know, we're obviously going to talk about employee competency within that as well, which is key. One thought, by the way, I did have about what Martin and Andy was saying was it really encouraging the use of the vulnerability registration service. I think is really going to help as well as we look at, you know, trying to establish a sort of society where people feel confident to register their details externally. I think is going to help too.
We can talk about staying ahead of regulatory requirements, Martin. You know, that's easy to do, but doing something about it is a challenge. And they're out of the 6 boxes and the key indicators that we thought that you could actually make a step change in staying ahead of regulatory requirements there. Which one jumps at you? Which one would you talk to?
So I think for me, it's the embedding vulnerability in the product and service design. It's a key gap that was identified by the FCA review. I think as part of other discussion topics I've had, it's one of the things that, you know, attendees feel, you know, we still haven't maximized that yet. I think there's a challenge there in terms of getting the right data into those processes. I think there's a challenge in terms of helping those people that are involved in product and service design know that they need to, you know, own, you know, they've got responsibility here. So I think that one stands out. We'll get into more detail later on, but I think that's a real fundamental one for me.
Andy, your thoughts on where would you hone in on where firms could do probably better to stay ahead of regulatory scrutiny as well as regulatory requirements?
Yeah, I mean, I would say all of them, but I guess that's overwhelming to think about trying to do everything at once. So I'm always a fan of kind of breaking things down into focusing on the end point and then working your way back maybe. So I think the FCA has made a real point in its most recent update about defining the outcomes.
Yeah.
So because that's product specific. The FCA can't do that for everybody. It can't say what good outcomes look like because that has to be about the product. You could argue that harms, for example, another thing that's in the regulation, are probably of four broad types. You know, you've got maybe financial loss, maybe physical personal harm. You've got maybe data loss, which is obviously exposes people to all sorts of poor outcomes, and then probably like loss of social standing, reputation, that kind of thing. The 4 broad harms that might apply to everybody, but the actual outcomes are specific to your product. So if you define your outcomes, then you know what good and poor outcomes look like, and that makes it easier then to be able to say all of the how do we do all of these things, because your key exam questions are how do we do it, how do we know that we do it, and how do we show that we do it. And if you're focusing on those 3 things, then you can do that, but it's contextual to your product for sure.
Yeah, Chris?
2 things. So obviously talked about empowering staff. The argument here is that traditional training programs, they embed knowledge, but they don't necessarily guarantee competency. So that's one area. The other bit is about continuous improvement. And if you think about consumer duty as this ongoing flywheel of improvement across the organization, embedding it in the culture becomes even more important, and culture is all about people. So for me, the empowering of staff and making them competent is very much linked to continuous improvement and ongoing cultural change.
Hey, nice segue into our next discussion point there.
Hey.
Your questions coming in. There's some really cool ones coming in. I know that some people are asking for advice and guidance on tech as well as training there. Chip in is also, if you see that people, this is about peer learning as well as panelist learning as well. So chip in, feedback and feed forward are always welcome on this. When we talk about empowerment and case handling and supporting frontline staff, we're not stating the obvious here, but we're stating that what firms should be doing. But creating that environment, as Chris says, is still a challenge, Martin. You've got to give organizations and individuals who work in these organizations the right tools in place and the right tech in place for them to be empowered and to use those there. What are your thoughts on where we are now and where the regulator potentially wants to take us in terms of like making sure that empowerment actually does happen and it's not a buzzword?
Yeah, I don't believe it's a buzzword anymore, but I do believe that there's a lot of moving parts in a frontline operation, right? In terms of people coming in, people coming out, different levels of experience, life experience, things like that. So I think that's still something that organizations wrestle with. So when it comes to training, there is a lot of good training out there that gets people up to speed. I think there is a lot of focus now in terms of making sure that there is a centralized resource to support that frontline team, because you can't give everyone every bit of knowledge. So you need to build in a smaller number of experts. And of course, you need the right sort of systems and processes to make all of that easy. I think one of the things that organizations are starting to realize is this can be a real stress on individuals, handling these things, knowing what to do with them. So when we talk to operational leaders, they always want to know, how can we make it easier? How can we make it faster? And ultimately, that is about, better outcomes for the end customer, but it's also about reducing the stress and the impact on the individuals in the front line as they go through those processes.
I'm going to throw a bit of a curveball in here, Andy and Chris. Maybe you can pick it up or smack me back down or get me back in my box again here. But we talk about empowerment, and I don't think anybody would dissuade you from that. Staff would buy into that. Customers would buy into that. Obviously, people making decisions in a confident decisions in a safe environment. We talk about psychological safety on a number of other webinars which we ran, but it's overcoming initially the resistance to change, isn't it, to create that environment there. How have you done that at Fidelity? Has that been an issue? And if so, have you had to change perhaps empowering staff so that they understand that they're comfortable with making decisions, and have also managers had to change their approach to empower, because that's where the rubber hits the road?
Sure. For me, the key was going with the flow. So understanding that there is a flow to things, and that whatever you're doing, you're only influencing a part of that flow. And so if you don't consider the wider flow, the danger is you become, like the Thames barrier. You're just constantly battering against what's happening. So you have to understand everything else that people have to do and work out how you fit it in. So for example, when we developed our approach to recording disclosures of vulnerability and additional needs, we created a record that ideally flows with the existing conversation. So it would have an order within it that would make sense in a conversation. And that when we provided one area where we did feel we needed a script was around consent, because we needed to make sure that we'd given them the right information about what we were going to complete, what we were going to record, how we were going to use it, and whether they were given a consent, a knowing consent to that, not just a, is that all right, yes or no kind of thing. So we had a script for that, but we designed the scripts with the people to say, does this flow in conversation? Rather, does it make sense? If someone's told you something, it sort of makes sense at that point that you go, well, is it all right if I record that in order to help you with the thing we were discussing helping you with? And that's how we're going to use that. It makes sense. And that's how we found that it works. Whereas trying to just say, these are the things we need to get across, and now say that in the middle of a conversation just wouldn't have worked the same. So I think the flow is really important. And then building support for it being the right thing to do as well, and understanding that it helps you to deliver good outcomes. So what we found that we were surprised by is in introducing that system, which allows us to have the data we need and to help people on an ongoing basis and all those good things, what we didn't expect is that it would have a clear, significant impact in the quality of the conversation as well. And actually it was opening up more conversation for people because, again, they learned to trust more, they felt supported, and people are saying in their NPS, their net promoter feedback, so their customer satisfaction surveys, customers are commenting on how well supported they feel, that they appreciated that we adjusted for their hearing loss or whatever it might be.
And managers happy to empower staff, and was there any disconnect between staff reporting back to managers saying, well, I've made this decision, I made this call because of that? Do they feel that there is that psychological safety around them, that managers will actually trust that individual there?
Yeah, well, a couple of things on that we found. I mean, firstly, I think most managers don't want to spend their day wiping people's bottoms, right? You don't want to be giving people permission to do things that are just like, yeah, of course, absolutely. But you don't want to be giving the keys to the kingdom away as well. So I understand that. I think that those roles and responsibilities are quite key. So we operate a pyramid model of handling. So along the bottom, you've got the largest segment, which is most people can do most things for most people. So basic inquiries are the majority of what people might receive. So if someone says, I can't hear you very well, then that person can offer to just speak a little bit more clearly, to speak a little bit more loudly, give them a little bit more time on the phone. They have those options. And that's just, of course, that's within my remit, because that's just me changing how I'm going to talk to you on the phone. That's the majority of the types of support we provide. So most people doing most things. When it gets more complex, it's about having a smaller group of people whose responsibility it is to make more complex decisions, and they can be trained more effectively to do that. And that training comes into use because those smaller volumes go into a smaller group, which means they come across it more regularly. Whereas those smaller volumes of complex things in a larger group, they just hit and miss. You could be trained on something today, and then 2 years later, you've never had a conversation about that. We can't train you every week to remember it. So how do you keep that alive? So we put those smaller things into a smaller group, and that's roles and responsibilities then get reinforced.
And Andy, I'm going off script a little bit here, but just something that came to mind that I think is important with that is I imagine you've had to think about how differently you measure people in the front line, because if you look at just it's AHT, that is the single measure of whether you're good at your job. That's going to present real challenges in terms of encouraging people to go through that flow and take that time that they need to work through that process with customers.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what we found again is, and this has happened over time, this hasn't happened in a boardroom somewhere where a group of people decided a thing and we rolled it out. Over time, we've become more comfortable with understanding that, again, through things like consumer duty, you focus on the outcome. So if you measure the outcome, then it takes as long as it takes, and that is the optimal amount of time. So you've obviously got to then use that data to be able to workforce plan, but one leads the other, not the other way around. It's a bit of your chicken and egg, or horse and cart kind of thing. If you drive people to do things in a targeted time, because we're using that targeted time to deliver our resource, then you keep reinforcing the circle. You keep resourcing for the time you'd planned as opposed to the time it takes. So it's better to have an organic environment where people can are assessed against having a great conversation and delivering a good outcome. There are obviously processes and procedures that need to be followed to drive consistency, but that becomes a hygiene factor of the risk element. What risk are we posing to our business by not following our processes this amount of times, for example, and how do we then improve that? Isn't the same as you as an individual need to do this in this amount of time, and in that time you need to wedge in all these things to pass your audits. And that's traditionally how things were done in the past, and we've moved more towards great conversation, good outcome. It takes how long as it takes, and then the data of how long it takes becomes more accurate over time. That is the optimal time, therefore that's how we resource plan.
Chris, when you look at training, tick, empowerment, tick, but there's still a gap here. We exposed this gap when we had Chris Fitch from the Money Advice Trust on our webinar when we were talking about approaches to training. There is a disconnect there. Talk us through some of the results that on the right-hand side that we received, and how do firms close that gap, and making sure that the competency gap doesn't actually impact, as Andy has said, on client outcomes.
Well, it's funny, really picking up on what Andy and Martin were just saying. You know, the aim here is to get call center teams to make decisions and almost to go off script and do the right thing for the customer, because it's about customer outcomes. If they follow a script or they follow metrics that are very siloed, like average handling time or first call resolution, these are internally focused metrics. And so they need to think more about outcomes, right? That's a cultural change. And cultural change happens through people. People need to be competent in what they're doing. And therefore, these numbers that we see in front of us, there's opportunities to improve them by making sure that they're able to think on their feet and make the right decisions in the context and in the moment. So I just think there's huge opportunity to rethink the way we get our staff really competent at making those decisions and thinking on their feet. I think that's essential to the culture of any business.
Andy, stress and burnout are a real issue for staff in general, actually, but also more focus on the frontline staff as well as call center staff there. Where have you seen this, and what can we do about it as a sector? I've posted the feedback from the new Retail Trust Health reports there that's highlighted and flagged some of these issues there. Talk us through where, perhaps you had to be much more proactive and understanding about creating a different environment to support issues and challenges around stress and burnout.
Yeah, I mean, I'll keep it short and sweet in terms of at an overall level. I think it's just remember their people and customers. Often our staff are our customers too, right? So their vulnerability is just as relevant as the customers that they're dealing with. Anything that has a person on the other end of it has the potential to have a personal circumstance that impacts the quality of the outcome. So just being kind whenever and recognizing that whenever we're dealing with people, but on a practical level, having support around them in terms of structures of support. So most companies will have access to some form of employee assistance program, EAP, making sure that people are aware of that, not just because we put a notice on the notice board that's got the number, right? Being able to identify when somebody's dealt with something that potentially could be triggering, and obviously all sorts of things can be triggering, but there are things that are highly likely, topics like suicide, domestic abuse, people being shouted at, threatened, sworn at. Those are the sorts of things that can create problems for people. And so when you identify that those conversations have happened, those interactions have happened, how do you then follow up with that person actively to make sure they're okay? And that's not just one conversation that says, are you okay? Because everyone's response to that is, yes, I'm fine, unless they're literally in a crisis and they're broken down. So I'm fine one day, but what about the next day? What about the day after that? So maybe a few days later, have you been thinking about it a lot? Has it been on your mind? Have you been sleeping okay? Because those are the kind of things that might tell people that, yes, I'm not beyond this, I need to talk to somebody. And then you can signpost them more effectively to EAP, mental health first aid, that kind of thing.
Sorry, Martin, jump in there. Yeah, go on.
Yeah, I was just going to quickly add to that, because I think everything that Andy says there makes so much sense. And I was in a discussion group on Tuesday also about vulnerability, and there's a real recognition that even though that makes sense, there's not a huge uptake of that, it seems, across organizations in using data to actually support their colleagues. We've been talking about that for a little while in terms of how can you use vulnerability data. You can use it for your own customers. Obviously, you can use it to understand what people have been exposed to. So although it makes so much sense, there still seems like a huge opportunity to actually close a gap there. I don't understand what gets in the way of like what's stopping organizations doing it, but there definitely seems to be a real recognition of we're not doing it enough across different organizations.
And I appreciate and understand that to minimize that stress, burnout, and maybe potentially overload, the importance of the role that technology plays in that, Martin. And it's conscious that we're talking about the individual, but we're also talking about the apparatus around that individual.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, it's where we've always got questions around how can technologies make things quicker, because the focus has been on speed, but we are starting to get those questions. Okay, but how can we make things easier, because it's the ease of this that's going to help reduce the burden on these highly stressed out kind of individuals at times.
And as we were talking, we forgot you were in the room, all 600 of you, but no, we didn't. Honestly, we didn't. You very kindly answered, and you can multitask far better than I can. Which of the following methods do you find most effective in encouraging customer disclosure of vulnerability? And the lead answer, Chris, staff actively listening and asking questions. 85%, training staff on specific wordings, 52%.
Yeah, I mean, these are amazing. This is great to hear from everyone on this webinar, and also there's incredible comments coming through the chat as well. Absolutely brilliant insight. So thank you. But yeah, that for me, that goes back to the whole point, which is how do we empower our teams to think on their feet, be very tailored in the way they interact with different vulnerable customers' vulnerabilities. It says a lot that it's 85%. That's obviously a key part of this. It's around behaviors and culture. Ultimately, it's great.
Andy, does that resonate with you, what you're seeing at conferences, webinars, events, and also from your peers when you're talking about that encouraging customers disclosure as being a key regulatory expectation, but also, I think that firms want to own this much, much more, don't they?
100%. It's really, really great to see that result come out on top by such a strong margin as well. It very much is about the conversation, and the conversation is where it's almost always relevant, because I think if people are self-serving digitally, and it's not to say that people don't need support digitally, but if people get to the end of a process, then the normal process works for them. Now, there might be some nuance in that perhaps it wasn't as effective, or maybe even they actually made a wrong choice or made a mistake in that needs to be rectified. So those things need to be picked up. But generally speaking, if someone can self-serve digitally, then by definition, the normal process that a customer can go through is accessible and available to them. The additional support that people often need is when they call, because very rarely is the call, the conversation, whether it's face-to-face or over the phone, the primary channel. We're all in a digital world. We all offer digital options. Very rarely is a firm these days offering their primary channel is conversation. So the conversation is a support option by itself. If someone's ringing you, if someone's coming in to see you, then they've probably got something that they need your help with. And so that's where the rubber really does hit the road. There's a couple of other points I wanted to make at this juncture as well. One is, we're not just talking, when we say frontline staff, we're not just talking about contact center staff either. We have teams operationally that are processing customer instructions, doing the paperwork bits, doing the written communications, and they will see and be exposed to things too and need to respond to those things. We have people processing death certificates in bereavement scenarios, and sometimes the family have sent things like suicide notes in a pack of documents. You cannot unsee that when you've read it. And so again, the person's ability to be able to escalate that and get support, and then us to get support around them when something like that's come through the post, is just as important. And then related to that, I want to give a shout out to grief first aiders. A lot of firms will have mental health first aiders. Grief first aid is exactly the same cost. It's exactly the same type of training, i.e. 3 half-day sessions. It's as detailed, but it's specifically around grief, which is a very different type of mental health challenge, and also just experience. It's beyond mental health. It's just a life experience that almost everyone will go through, and it's loss that goes beyond just death as well. Grief can be the loss of anything. It can be the loss of a colleague who was made redundant, who was your best mate. It could, anything where you've lost something. It can be the loss of a sense of person. There's a really great series of adverts at the minute on Channel 4 about dementia. Mum died first when this happened. That person is lost in that moment because they're not there anymore. They're different. And so that grief hits before they die, and then it hits again, and then it hits again. So grief first aiders play a really important role. If you have mental health first aiders, please do consider putting some of that mental health first aid budget into getting some grief first aiders.
And if anybody can post the chat, the link into the chat of where they can sign up to that would be really help the audience there. Just want to move on to use of vulnerability data, because this was flagged up by Chris Fitch again. Thank you for that. 85% of surveyed firms reported taking significant action to consider vulnerability in service and product design, but as we've quoted here, only 29% say they test the impact of products and services. Test the impact of products or services have on vulnerable customers, or if their needs are met. Chris, when you look at that, does that explain why 40 to 65% of surveyed vulnerable customers report that products do not meet their needs?
I think it's a big part of it, yeah. And Martin alluded to this earlier, didn't he, about the fact that the FCA said in March that vulnerability is not just a job of the contact center team or customer facing teams, but it's absolutely part of the way we design products. So, and that links back to outcome testing as well, and making sure,
Yes.
as Andy is saying, we've tested outcomes for the different products and different customer cohorts. Then you get that culture of vulnerability established across all areas of the business. So I love your diagram, by the way. It's another classic, Philip. Just a piece of art. It's brilliant. I love it. Thank you.
He just gets his revenge in first. It's like that. Yes, thank you. I love this flywheel, Martin. Yeah, missing a trick if you're not using a system or process. I'm going to actually, draw it with my hand because I love my diagram so much. I'm going to draw it on the screen and there. But important that technology supports that feedback loop, isn't it, in the organization to generate that go forward and that continuous improvement.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the organizations that seem to be doing the best at this are, they've got their systems and processes joined up. They've got a single view of kind of vulnerability for their customers. They work hard on ensuring the customers only have to tell them once, all of that. And obviously they've got the right governance processes to feed that in. But ultimately with this one, I think you've got to commit as an organization to have a testing process. I think at the moment, the testing process is, well, let's see what has happened when this is live out there with a lot of customers, and that's just not sufficient. So it's great if you got that feedback mechanism in, but it's too late. You could have tested this on a smaller population. You could have worked with people that might be impacted to try and make it better in the first place. But it seems to be well recognized that that's a clear gap and a clear opportunity.
What does that feedback loop look like, Andy, at Fidelity then? So
part of it is gathering information from lots of different sources and then being able to utilize that information. I suppose, we would all recognize as firms that we have an abundance of data. Sadly, we sometimes struggle to access that data and to also bring it all together into a place where it can be analyzed. But we've got to get input from customers directly, and that's not just through complaints or customer satisfaction surveys. That's got to be through call trends. More and more now, firms are using technology through their telephony systems that allows them to be able to analyze what's being said on calls through text analysis or through transcript analysis. AI is obviously giving us more functionality to be able to put those things together across more different topics. So all of that stuff helps you to be able to analyze the reality, not just the set piece stuff. When you send somebody a survey, you're obviously framing things by the asking of the questions. You're going to get stuff you expected and stuff you didn't expect, especially if you let people type things or say things in a free text scenario. Same with your customer feedback, same with your employee feedback, give us an idea, tell us what's not going well, what's not going well. But actually that's separate from what really happens. What can we observe in the transaction data? What can we hear in the calls that tell us the live issues and the live trends? And then obviously the stuff that we record specifically around vulnerabilities and additional needs, that data needs to be available to you. So one of the reasons when we created our recording tool that we had the category and subcategory of the disclosure. So that's using the FCA's 4 drivers and then some of the categories from the taxonomy table as well. And then the category and a subcategory for the support need as well allows us to do all that analysis. So what I now know is that one of the most common forms of support that our customers tell us about is the fact that they don't feel comfortable using digital services. So that gives me a number that says, and specific people that says, firstly, when I'm doing new project work, don't just default to digital. I can tell you exactly who definitely won't use digital. And I can also tell you that this number of people are not comfortable with it. We know that there will be more, but these are the people we know about right now. And it's a significant number. And I can also then link that back to the customer satisfaction surveys to tell you exactly how much they value the contact center interaction. So how important that is to not then say, oh, if you're calling us, by the way, did you know you can do this online? And I don't know if you've had this experience, right? But as a consumer in the modern era, like in 1990, if someone said, oh, you can apply online, you might go, wow, that's cool. Now, the fact that you can apply online, like, of course you know that. And if I wanted to do that, I'd have been there already. And I've either tried it and it didn't work, in which case you telling me to go online is really, really annoying me. Or I chose not to, right? I've picked up the phone already. It's too late. And this is where I want to be. So serve me where I want to be. And anyone who's got a contact center is currently committed to providing that service. You hire people to do it. We hire nearly 400 people across our contact centers to do that. We are committed to providing that channel. So we need to know that when you call us, the response is, great, you've called. That's what I'm here for. Not, hey, did you know you could, go and do this somewhere else and not bother me?
That's a lovely opening. That makes it an inclusive conversation, doesn't it? You're not on the back foot reacting or responding to that. Yeah, I like that, Martin. But this data and that Andy's capturing at Fidelity is great to feed back up the food chain, isn't it? As well. And sometimes you just need to cut through the noise by having data points and say, look, this is what's happening. We need inclusive design. We need to course correct here, here, and here.
Yeah, I think people get a little bit overwhelmed. I think nobody's saying that they haven't got enough data. I think they feel that they've got enough data. Sometimes you could change the data, you could get some better data, but everyone's got enough to be doing something with. It's how you try and find those nuggets, focus on the right things. Andy mentioned AI in his update there as well. It's one of the things I'm really optimistic about in terms of AI's ability to analyze data and cut through some of that noise to the key, to the key things that matter, and being able to do that at pace. I think we struggle to do that, with human analytic teams and things like that. Do this at pace whilst we're still serving customers, we're still selling new policies, all of that stuff. I think if we can speed that process up, we can then get changes back out there quickly, and just get better outcomes for customers, much more quickly.
I actually opted for a flywheel. Chris has opted for a fish eating a fish. I mean, you, the audience, you can decide which is the better graphic. I'll let you choose that. And by the way, I want to nudge the audience in a behavioural way to indicate that flywheels are better than fish there. But given the fishery arguments that are going on in Europe and in UK, maybe you're referencing something which I don't know, Chris. There, talk us through why you put this infographic or this graphic up of a fish.
Well, let me say it like this. If you look at the chat right now in this webinar, which is amazing, everyone's talking about why don't we all get together and talk about vulnerability as a topic? And I'm like, wow, this is amazing. And by the way, that's why we've got a conference that we're launching on the 2nd of December. And we'll cover
nice build.
Yeah, but that's there to help these networking conversations happen. And we think we can offer something of value to the industry around this thing. And for me, culture, it's cliched, but it's true. Culture eats strategy for breakfast. We know that if you've got a good culture where everyone is really focused on supporting, for example, vulnerable customers, you're going to get great customer outcomes. So that's why, for me, this is absolutely central to all the things that we're talking about. And we can see it right now in the chat. Culture is what people are talking about at the minute. So yeah, there you go.
Thank you very much.
The others agree with me on that one, but yeah, it's key.
And it's important that the culture, we talk about cultural measurement, we talk about cultural indicators, forward-looking indicators rather than lagging indicators there. It's important to drive that flywheel, Chris, of improvement back through the organization and all these factors are interconnecting there. Obviously, the Culture is Contagious speech by Emily at the FCA, we'll reference that in the chat, is a really good document to say that you can actually supercharge your culture in a positive and healthy way. I'll just put that there, and so you can reference that there. I know that's easier said than done, but to help and assist, our colleagues at Elephants Don't Forget also referenced some FOS case studies, picking up on what Andy was saying earlier, that there's some great case studies to learn good practice from other organizations in other sectors as well there. And I do think that sometimes we have to go backwards to go forward, that whilst culture is not one and done, there, it's an iterative process. Andy, how are you recognizing, identifying where there are cultural gaps, and what are you doing to address those?
I'm going to answer that question slightly differently, I think,
Yeah.
because I think what often people don't say about culture is that it's an output. And it's an output from all of the input, everything in the entire organization, from the front door, the carpet, the chairs, the equipment that you use at home, every interface. So it's very hard to influence or change culture because typically you can only change a few inputs at a time, and there are thousands of inputs that make up that culture and what people do. So no single thing is going to be big enough to impact culture by itself, which means you need to try and change lots of things, which comes back to the point earlier about why governance should be a bigger point, because structure, infrastructure, roles and responsibilities, operating models, those are the things that will influence multiple inputs and will help you to nudge culture in a positive direction. And when multiple inputs are counter to the culture you're trying to create, then the desired output, the culture, becomes conflicted. And then I guess the other thing is culture is reinforced by behavior, what people actually do day to day. So if you think about the culture on the tube, for example, if you've ever been on the tube in London, you'll know there's a culture of not talking to each other on the tube. It's not written down anywhere. Nobody talks about that. Nobody says that is the culture. Nobody decided it in a boardroom. But it's pretty clear that that is the culture that's reinforced by everybody on the tube. And if somebody does break that culture, it becomes a little bit awkward, and it becomes a little bit clear that that's not what everybody signed up to, even though nobody signed up to it. So these things are quite homogenous. They just happen over time, but they're the result of lots of inputs, not all of which are on a nice, neat structure or strategy or chart, or even on a diagram or in paper or in writing or on purpose. So things happen. So I think the structures are important because you can influence multiple inputs and nudge your culture in a really positive direction.
They should all come to Morrison's in Blackpool. Yeah, you can't get out of that place without having a conversation with somebody.
Different culture.
Exactly. Make the case for technology, and questions, Martin, that folks should be asking themselves to help and support frontline staff, and support vulnerable customers.
Yeah, so I think, like we've said, I think if you look at what Andy's just spoken about, that culture is a series of inputs. Then how are you going to measure those inputs, identify what works if you don't have the right systems and data captured throughout the process in order to do that? Governance relies on data relies on having systems and processes to capture that and get that to the right place in the right context, to the right people. So it's absolutely fundamental to everything. It's a key input, and we know we can't just rely on colleagues' knowledge and working on their own. We've got to support them, and we've got to give them that ability to capture that information so that it can go into the right governance process to shape everything that's done by the organization.
And lots of things that the regulator is doing on technology at the moment. You can see it on the FCA's website, but also a number of trade associations doing tech sprints as well, to actually make sure that in a safe environment that technology is aiding and supporting organizations really take the next step in their journey to support better outcomes. I want to talk briefly about training before we move on, Chris, from that. I don't think it's a question of necessarily having training. I think that's a given there, but it's the right training and making sure that you get the output from that to evidence back that you're continually improving customer outcomes. I think that's happening, isn't it? Much more than it was, say, 1 or 2 years ago.
Yeah, and there's been some great examples in the chat of all the training that's happening. The key question, I think, now is to just make sure that training is effective and making sure staff are really competent in what they're doing. So, yeah, definitely a key part of the jigsaw puzzle there.
Yeah. We're coming into land now. Panelists, fingers on buzzers if you see any questions that you think, oh gosh, we haven't covered off. And if we don't have any questions there, what aren't we talking about? Basing it and ripping this question shamelessly off a trigonometry podcast there. What question haven't we asked or answered on this webinar that we should be covering off?
I would say there's a question about inclusive design. A lot of people will have heard about it. A lot of people might talk about inclusive design, and you'll often hear people saying that that's where we should get to. We should get to inclusive design, but what they don't often say is that inclusive design isn't an absolute, it's an ambition. So you can become more inclusive in your design. There's very few things that you can design that would be inclusive for everybody. But if you design things that are exclusive to certain people, then you're ignoring that group of people. You're underserving them or choosing not to serve them. And that's sometimes by accident if you do it in design. Like if you say this product is not for these people, we won't sell it to them. That's one thing, that's fine. But if you say this product's for everybody, and then by design you exclude people from your service, then that's not okay. So how do you design things that understand where people might struggle with that design? And if you can't build it better to make it inclusive for more people, how do you build those options in from the beginning of what if they can't, where do they go then, so that it doesn't become A, difficult to identify when somebody can't do it because you've thought about it, you've built that in, and B, it doesn't become a scrabble around for how do we serve this person who can't do the thing that we all thought everyone would be able to do because we were a bit naive and we designed it for a person that doesn't exist. You know, the idea of a perfect or reasonable customer that probably doesn't really exist.
Thank you for that. We are going into our final slides, but if you've picked up anything in the chat, Martin, please holler there. Chris, talk us through what we've got super excitedly at the end of this year.
So there's so much chat about forming a group, right? And that's wonderful. We've put this conference on, and it will be as an independent conference to allow all these conversations to take place in a facilitated environment as you wish. Any money that we make from this event, profit, will go to charity, and probably to a vulnerability charity. We haven't defined that yet. But there's a link that, Philip, I think you can post in the chat, that will allow people to register their interest, not a commitment, but interest in the early bird ticket, which is £199. We think we can fill the room. And with the fact we've got the lead person at the FCA talking about consumer duty, there'll be case studies, there'll be panel discussions, there'll be best practice. We'll have a whole room full around vulnerability with experts on the topic. We're super excited about this, and we think there's massive demand for it. And judging by the chat, it looks like there is. So please register that link, go and have a look if you're interested, and we'll put you on that list to start with. That's my plug. Thank you.
Fantastic. Next steps to finally conclude, and you know, we'll put up another question on the poll because I want to know how people are going to take away and what they're going to do differently on this. Martin, what's the call to action? What would you like firms to take away and walk away from this webinar to do and act?
Yeah, so I think from our perspective, obviously think very carefully about what technology you're using, how effectively you're using it, really just, you know, and think about it from the perspective of supporting your employees, not just the end customers. One that I didn't think about, but just there's something from the chat as well. I just don't want to lose this. So Andy mentioned earlier in the session about grief first aiders, and I noticed earlier in the chat that people were talking about it and interested in courses and stuff. So I just want to elaborate on that because I think that some people hadn't really realized that that's a thing, and it sounds like it's really, really important. So I think if I can have two, and that's a little surprise one, just to draw something from the chat, I think seriously consider that because it seems like that's something that could be really important. It could be a gap in organizations.
Brilliant. Amazing. Thank you, Martin. Andy.
Yes. Join your trade body working groups. All of the trade bodies, certainly in financial services, have vulnerability working groups or networks. Please join them if you want to keep the conversation going. Aside from attending the wonderful event that you've got planned, these are regular things that happen. And there's a company called Collaboration Network, which is cross-sector. Vulnerability Week is week commencing the 23rd of June. There are lots and lots of webinars and discussions happening during that week that the Collaboration Network is hosting. You don't have to be a member to attend their events during Vulnerability Week. So if you don't have the budget to sign up and become a member, or you want to give it a try, then that's a good week to do so. There's lots and lots happening.
Amazing, amazing. Yes, and we will share any of the grief first aiders details there. We're agnostic in this, so please do your due diligence over the training providers that we may post out and share. But if you can knowledge share with us as well. Absolutely. We've had the Collab Network, good guys there, and they do some good stuff on that as well. Yes, I want to shout out to all trade associations, including my own, and they're at PIM Firm as well. So if you're in wealth management, yes, we have a vulnerability working group, which is ably hosted by my colleague Alex Roberts there. So please do get in contact with PIM Firm or other trade associations as well, because they do great support. And that's it from us. We've actually come into land on time, which is amazing, which we've never done before. So you can twiddle your thumbs for the next 20 seconds if you want to make sure that we actually do things consistently, like actually finish not on time there. But thank you so much indeed, Martin and Andy and Chris, for supporting us in this webinar. Difficult, challenging conversations to have. I know there are not necessarily some quick wins in everything there, but I think sometimes it starts with challenging one's thinking, doesn't it? And then that triggers off the response. Or shall I say, Chris, the flywheel. To actually
all about the diagram, Philip. All about the diagram.
It's all about the diagrams there. Enjoy the rest of your day, and PDF version of the slides and the webinar, recording of the webinar will be made available to you at the end of the week. Have a great, wonderful long weekend. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Right. Bye. Bye.